So now we're going to change our focus, and we're going to move from talking about the server side to talking about the client side of this application. And this is particularly fun, if for no other reason that I just learned some new stuff a couple days ago that I've integrated into the slides, which I didn't know about last time I taught this course. So this is going to be a new and improved description of how to write a client. And so we're going to take a look at how you can use these Spring 6 and beyond HTTP interface client mechanisms to declaratively generate proxies that will then be invoked by the client driver to send and receive get and post requests to and from the microservices. And this is really neat, and I'm very happy that I've figured out how to do this. Once again, this is a great example of not quite figuring it out by reading the documentation, but with my good buddy ChatGPT, we figured out what to do, and I'll talk about that when we get to this discussion. So we have a class called the QuoteClient that the driver program uses to asynchronously invoke remote method invocations on the API gateway microservice, which in turn then routes those requests to the appropriate microservice. And why do we have a QuoteClient? Well, first we have a QuoteClient so we can do some auto-wiring. And what are we auto-wiring? We're auto-wiring the QuoteAPI. We're going to look at the QuoteAPI in just a second. So the QuoteAPI is the thing that's going to be implemented using Spring's HTTP interface client features. And we have a bunch of different methods here. We're just going to look at a handful of them, but they all work pretty much the same way. So we have one called post quotes, which is going to take the route name of the specific microservice we want, which is either the handy microservice or it's the zippy microservice. And then we pass in the list of quote IDs. And the key thing to note here, this is very important, this route name is what we will use to update the request so it goes to the gateway with the appropriate microservice as the first parameter, and then the gateway will determine which microservice to forward to or route to, strip off that name, and then forward the rest of the URI plus the parameters and the request body, if necessary, to the service. So this is the thing I didn't know how to do before, but now I know how to do it. We'll talk more about that. So let's talk about QuoteAPI. And this is the Spring 6 and beyond means that abstracts away all the details of making remote method invocations using HTTP. This is really cool. So QuoteAPI, we've got these various proxy methods, get all quotes, post quotes, search. I think there's searchEX as well. And if you look carefully at these methods, they mimic very similarly, not identically, but they mimic most of the parts of the signature of the controller methods, absent the route name part. But otherwise, they return the same types, they take the same parameters, and they have more or less the same annotations with the names we're going to see here. You can see these all return project flux types. This is the part that's really cool about the Spring 6 and beyond HTTP interface client feature. It knows how to deal with reactive types, whereas retrofit, not so much. So we can't use retrofit in quite the same way, which is a shame because it's got some other cool things. But you can tell that they really thought more carefully about how to integrate the HTTP interface client features with Spring to work with Webflux. Now, this is the other thing to note. The names of the annotations for parameters are also the same, or very largely the same, as the names for the Spring controller annotations. So, for example, we have post. And you can see here that we've got the request body annotation. That's the same that's on the server side. You'll also notice that we have these things called path variable. And path variable is how you provide dynamic path routing. With retrofit, this was done with another annotation called @path. And when I first came to using Spring's HTTP interface client last year, when it was just Spring 6, I couldn't figure out for the life of me how to get the same behavior because they didn't have anything in Spring HTTP interface client called @path. And at the time, ChatGPT didn't know about HTTP 6 because the cutoff date was 2021 last year for ChatGPT. However, this was a feature that came in 2002. So when I went back to redo this stuff for this semester, I was like, I wonder if there's a way to get ChatGPT to help me with this. So I gave it an interface defined with retrofit with the @path annotation. And I said, what's the equivalent with HTTP interface client? And of course, the very first thing it said was, I don't know anything about HTTP interface client. I'm like, well, that's weird. So what I did is I got the documentation link for Spring 6 or 7 now. It's actually on version 7, HTTP interface client. And I gave it to ChatGPT and I said, please go read this link and then explain to me what the equivalent version is. So it read the link, and then this is a great example of in-context learning, because it clearly hadn't really been explicitly trained on that before. So then it knew what it was, and it said, aha, the way to get the same behavior is to use the @variable path annotation. That works the same as the @path annotation in retrofit. And I was like a little skeptical because it seemed a little bit uncertain at first, but I said, I'll give it a shot, and lo and behold, it did in fact work. So what this is doing is this is saying, please take this route name and substitute that route name with this variable that's passed in. If you look at route name, it basically is open double quote, open curly brace, route name, lowercase, just like route name is here in the parameter, close curly brace, close double quote. So that's the way it matches things up. So that worked quite nicely. And you can also note here that the get exchange and post exchange are very similar to get mapping and post mapping in the controller side. So I suspect, I haven't tried this, but I suspect you could probably use ChatGPT in order to generate the Spring 6 and beyond HTTP interface client signatures from a controller with just a little bit of prompt engineering to make things work. And then the last piece of the puzzle here is the client beans class that makes one of these QuoteAPI objects. And we do it as usual with the annotation. And we have a method called getQuoteAPI. The key thing is here, it makes a QuoteAPI. That's really what should be highlighted here. And you can ignore that because I didn't have to do that anymore. We use the builder to make ourselves a web client that's connected to the gateway base URL. And then we use this HTTP service proxy factory in order to be able to connect the web client to a means to make a QuoteAPI object from the QuoteAPI.class file, which is kind of funny because it's really an interface, but .class is the name of the metadata that keeps track of the information about a type, in this case, the QuoteAPI, which we didn't have to write the implementations for. That was generated automatically for us by Spring using the annotations we just looked at. OK, so that is the end of the discussion of the client piece.